Okay. Hi, folks. I would like to take just a little bit of time here and talk about the basics of population ecology. And I think it's important to start with the question of what do we mean by population? A population is a group of individuals of the same species living and interacting in an area. And population ecologists tend to study things like growth, dispersion, and life history. Now, your book covers the idea of niche in the context of communities, and it makes sense to do it this way. But I also think it makes sense to introduce it in a population unit. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to use this classic example of these barnacles. So I'll go over this idea in class because I think it warrants discussion. But basically, these barnacles. So this is a very famous study. These barnacles live in the intertidal zone. And what I would like you to think about to prepare for discussion is which part of the intertidal zone is most difficult to make a living in. Keeping in mind that these are aquatic organisms. So you might think about which parts tend to be exposed to air more often and therefore subject to desiccation, which parts have the largest temperature fluctuations, which are difficult to adapt to, and so on. And so what we'll do is we'll ask the question, why does this upper intertidal zone barnacle, and you can, this is a crazy word, but it's pronounced thamellus. Why does thamellus choose to live in the upper intertidal zone, and why does balanus choose to live in the lower intertidal zone? Or maybe it's not a choice. Maybe it's a result of ecological interactions. So we'll take some time to talk about this, and we'll talk about it in the context of fundamental versus realized niche. So in the absence of a interaction with another species, a population occupies, rather, its fundamental niche. So the fundamental niche can be defined as an organism's potential niche before biotic interactions. Now it's important to realize that this is rarely the case. I mean, I can't think of any populations that live in isolation from others. And so most often, the niche that you see an organism occupying is its realized niche, which can be defined as its actual niche after biotic interactions. So by biotic interactions, remember, I mean things like competition and predation and herbivory, disease. These types of things all interact with each other to determine where you will find a certain organism in space, what that organism eats. All of these things are part of its niche. One of the things that, so that's just a little background, and we'll come back to that when we cover community ecology, but I thought that mentioning niches right now was worthwhile. One of the things that ecologists study at the population level is the spatial dispersion patterns of organisms. And in general, there are three types. The first type is random. And so you can see here that these organisms are kind of dispersed randomly in space. There's no really rhyme or reason where you'll find them, and in this case, it's illustrating a random pattern, and these look like maple trees. That's not very common. A uniform dispersion pattern is illustrated by these penguins here, and you can see that that this isn't perfectly uniform, but in general, each organism, each individual in this population is approximately the same distance from its neighbor. This is a uniform dispersion pattern. The most common type of dispersion pattern is clumped. So you can see here, this is illustrated by these schooling fish. This clumped dispersion pattern, though, illustrates like groups of organisms living together. Now, it is important to consider scale when you're talking about an organism's, or population's rather, dispersion pattern. For example, if we were to sample at a smaller scale and just look at this much of the population, we might come to a different conclusion than if we were to look at a larger spatial scale. In the latter case, we might think that it's a uniform or a random dispersion pattern. By expanding out, you can see that it is highly clumped. It's kind of the same thing. Like, think about the dispersion of humans in New York State. If you looked at just Manhattan Island, you might come to the conclusion that humans are highly uniformly dispersed in New York State. If you expand out to the entire state, you will come to a different conclusion, one that suggests that humans are clumped, because most humans in New York State live in New York City. So scale is important. Now, what I would like you to think about is what scenarios can you imagine causing each type of dispersion pattern? So, in other words, what types of organisms illustrate a random dispersion pattern? Which types illustrate a clump dispersion pattern or a uniform dispersion pattern? Which types of ecological interactions result in each type of pattern? These are questions that we'll take some time for in class. Now, another thing that population ecologists study is growth. Growth pattern that's illustrated here is called exponential growth. And on the side of the screen, you can see that the equation basically for the rate of growth. This is actually the derivative of the exponential growth equation if you're familiar with calculus. And what it says is that the rate of change in a population's growth pattern is determined by its population density, which means that large populations grow more rapidly than small populations. And it's also a function of this intrinsic growth value called R. And R is influenced. It's influenced by, for example, how many eggs a female lays, how quick the life cycle progresses, or how long it takes to complete the life cycle, and so on. And some extreme examples: humans have a really low intrinsic growth potential. It takes us a long time to reach sexual maturity. It takes 9 months to grow a human inside of a human female, and usually human females only have one child at a time. Contrast this with like a mosquito who can lay, hundreds to thousands of eggs at a time, and take instead of years to reach sexual maturity, days to reach sexual maturity. And so they can complete their life cycle relatively rapidly, and they therefore have a very high growth potential. Now, we will illustrate this with a little activity in class, but I think it's important to acknowledge what's wrong with this picture. What's wrong with this picture is that it requires unlimited resources. And of course, that is never the case. There are always checks and balances at population's growth. And I think I'd like to leave it there. We will talk in detail about logistic growth and density dependent and independent factors that control a population's growth and basically prevent exponential growth. But basically, what it comes down to is populations are subjected to limitations, and these limitations factor into the population's carrying capacity. So that is where we'll pick up. What I would like you to do prior to class is read the chapter 40 in your textbook and complete the chapter 40 quiz. Thank you for your attention.